Good evening. Good evening. Hello. Good evening, everyone. I feel very short on this podium, so. This podium was built for a much taller person with big heels, which is not me tonight. But good evening, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Adara Goldberg, and I am the director of the Holocaust Resource Center here at Kean University. It is our pleasure to welcome everyone to our annual Murray Pantirer Memorial Scholar Lecture, which is supported in full by the Holocaust Resource Foundation, a number whose family members of the original founders are here with us tonight. So welcome to you. Welcome to our teachers. May I see, by a show, everyone standing quietly. When we go to schools, we remind them that we can stand up without making a lot of noise. If we could have the teachers in the room stand up. Thank you. And I know we have a number of high school students who are here tonight. Can I have all of you stand up so we can recognize you? So many of the teachers who just rose are participants in the post-baccalaureate certificate in teaching the Holocaust and prejudice reduction, who have been at work today, in many cases from 7 o'clock in the morning, and they're still going now, because they believe that teaching and studying the Holocaust is imperative for our society. The students who are here tonight are students from Montclair High School, and they are all enrolled in the dual credit Holocaust and Genocide Studies class that is also supported by the Foundation and Kean University. And I think it's important for us to remember that no matter how bad things get and all the things that are beyond our control in the world, we have students of all ages, learners of all stages of life, who are here, who are giving their own time voluntarily to learn about this important subject matter. So let's just give them another round of applause, please. I believe that most people here are familiar with the work of the Holocaust Resource Center, and I am not going to repeat the remarks of my colleagues who are going to come shortly, except to say that this work has never been more in demand and more needed. Sarah Kuykendall, our assistant director who is here, who is a superstar, who made sure everything came together today without a hitch, or without any hitches that you saw, developed a presentation for really grade 6 and up on hate speech and anti-Semitism that has now been presented to more than 3,000 students since last March. And on the one hand, there's dismay that we need this education. The flip side of that I'm choosing to focus on is there are schools and there are educators and parents that are calling on us and saying that we need the support because we want to do better, and we want to do better for our children. And so I think it's important as we go into tonight's program, which of course is marking the 80th anniversary from this past spring of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, to remember that we all make choices. Our session earlier today was on Jewish responses to persecution. Everyone who is in this room is making a choice right now, that we are all active participants in learning and in improving the world. We are doing our Tikkun Olam by being here together. And so with that, I'm going to hand things over to President Lamont Repollet to offer some official greetings from Kean University. Thank you for being here.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Kean University. In 1982, a group of Holocaust survivors who built their lives in Union County, New Jersey, joined together to form a foundation that would advance their groundbreaking vision for Holocaust education. Their goal was to educate teachers and students about what happened to the victims, the legacy of survivors, and to ensure future generations know about and learn from the lessons of the Holocaust. The founding families believed that Kane University was an ideal location to create a center, a place where they can reach a wide range of educators and students who would answer their call to action. In partnership with Kane, the Holocaust Resource Center, one of the earliest of its kind in the United States, was established. That same year, in 1982, when Governor Thomas Kane established the first Council of Holocaust Education in the United States, he did so at the HRC. Since then, HRC has distinguished itself as a leader in the field of Holocaust education. The Jewish Foundation for the Righteous recognized the HRC at Kane as one of only 13 Holocaust centers of excellence in our country. Today, 41 years later, the Holocaust Resource Center stands firmly on its origins. The three pillars of its mission purposely reflect and honor the vision of its founders and their families: collections, commemoration, and of course, education. As the memory of that dark and tragic time recedes further into our history, and as we continue to face the challenges of racism and hate in our country and around the world, the work of the Holocaust Resource Center remains even more critical today. The current crisis in Israel reminds us all that the horrors of war are not just part of history. They continue to be a crushing reality for many in the Jewish community. This evening, we gather together for one of the HRC's signatures event, the annual Mary Pantirer Memorial Scholar Lecture on Giving Tuesday, a day when we all are encouraged to donate to organizations transforming their communities and the world. The HRC is one of those organizations. In 2023 academic year alone, HRC reached more than 19,000 students and 3,500 educators and 3,000 community members. Plus, think how far that ripple effect will reach. So today, on Giving Tuesday, I encourage you to consider supporting the HRC as it educates the next generation of upstanders. I understand information on how to make a donation is available in the lobby. This evening's event is named in honor of the late Mary Pantirer, a Polish-Jewish Holocaust survivor, Schindler Juden, and founding president of the Holocaust Resource Foundation. And it's fitting tonight that the lecture by Dr. Avinom Pat will focus on 1943 Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, its aftermath and legacy 80 years after the event. Thank you all for being here this evening, for being part of our ongoing efforts to remember the past, honor the present, and shape a better future for all. Now it is my pleasure to invite Julie Koppel, a granddaughter of Murray and Lucy Pantirer, to talk to us about her late grandfather and his contributions to Holocaust education and remembrance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. 2 weeks ago, I watched raw footage from the October 7th attack at a joint UJA-JNF event at the United Nations. Most of the footage was taken from the body cameras of the Hamas terrorists, as well as from the Israeli first responders. The scenes I witnessed reminded me of footage from the Holocaust. Innocent civilians being rounded up and shot, families torn apart, some murdered while others forced onto trucks and taken away, women brutalized and raped. It was extremely hard to watch, but I knew I couldn't look away. I then returned uptown to my home on the Upper East Side to find some of the posters of kidnapped Israeli children that I had hung up with my son and his friends the day before, now torn down. What is happening? How did the world get so dark so quickly? We've been watching anti-Semitism rear its ugly head for many years, but this is different. This feels like everywhere we turn, the world hates us. What kind of person has so much evil in their heart that they rip down a poster of a 9, now 10-month-old baby? And how many of these people are actually my neighbors? It's terrifying, and I'm scared. I have thought about my grandparents, Lucy and Murray Pantirer of blessed memory, many, many times over the last 7 weeks. In some ways, I am grateful that they, as Holocaust survivors, are not here to witness history repeat itself. But in other ways, I know they would be so proud of the response of the Jewish people during this time of crisis. I have no doubt that my grandfather would have been at the rally in DC, where we, together with 300,000 other Jews, marched together peacefully on the National Mall in solidarity with the State of Israel. My grandparents were proud Americans who loved this country and all the values and ideals that it represents. When Hitler tried to annihilate the Jewish race, my grandfather, the sole survivor of his family of 9, came to America and built a new life with my grandmother. This life was not created with revenge or hatred in their hearts, but rather filled with kindness, love, and moral clarity. It is precisely this moral clarity that is missing in America today, mostly with young people on many college campuses and all around the country. A generation where Osama bin Laden is praised on TikTok is a generation that has lost its moral compass. And while we can continue to scream from our rooftops, never again, the only way to make real change is by properly educating our youth. Of course, we need to continue to tell the stories of the Shoah and now of the tragic events of October 7th. But we also need to get back to the basics. College campuses are supposed to be places where our brightest youth are trained to become our future leaders, places where public discourse is encouraged and different opinions are valued and respected, but also where students feel safe and where there is zero tolerance for hate speech or threats of violence. Unfortunately, this is not the state of most college campuses today, because this fundamental difference between right and wrong and good and evil has been blurred. To quote former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, "For years, college presidents have allowed their campuses to become bastions of intolerance by permitting students to shout down the voices of others. They have also allowed campuses to become institutions of conformity, and this combination of campus conformity and intolerance has only gotten worse. It is no surprise that support for terrorism, dressed in the language of social justice, has emerged from this environment. My only hope is that educators, such as our speaker tonight, and all the teachers in this room, can respond effectively and swiftly to this crisis in higher education. This must be the ultimate wake-up call. Avi Noam Pat, PhD, is the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. He is the author of multiple books on Jewish responses to the Holocaust, including Finding Home and Homeland, Jewish Youth and Zionism in the Aftermath of the Holocaust, co-editor of a collected volume on Jewish displaced persons titled We Are Here, New Approaches to the Study of Jewish Displaced Persons in Post-War Germany, and is a contributor to several projects at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, including Jewish Responses to Persecution, 1938 to 1940. He recently completed a new book on the early post-war memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, The Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, The Afterlife of the Revolt. Together with David Slucky and Gabriel Finder, he is co-editor of a new volume, Laughter After, Humor and the Holocaust, and with Laura Hilton is co-editor of the new volume, Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust. His newest book, Israel and the Holocaust, will be published by Bloomsbury Press as part of its Perspectives on the Holocaust series in 2024. In spring 2022, he created and facilitated a new one-credit pop-up course at the University of Connecticut, Why the Jews Confronting Anti-Semitism, which reached over 1,600 students in the first semester. In 2022 to 23, he served as visiting professor of Holocaust Studies at New York University and will become professor of Holocaust Studies at NYU in January 2024. Dr. Pat, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Good evening. Thank you for the warm welcome and for the kind remarks and the powerful, very clear statement emphasizing the value and the power of education and what we're all doing here. I want to thank you all for being here this evening. I had the opportunity to meet with the teachers before. I want to emphasize and reiterate how important the work that all of you are doing is, and thank you again for your dedication, and thank you to all of the students who are here with us this evening as well. As you've heard, now is a critical time for all of us to be engaged in this work of thinking critically and learning from the past so we can understand our present and hopefully prepare for a better future. I want to thank my hosts from Kean University and the Holocaust Resource Center, and thank the family of Murray Pantirer for creating this lecture series, and thank you all for being here this evening. As has been mentioned, and as many of you likely know, this year in 2023, we have marked the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which broke out on April 19th, 1943, the first night of Passover, when the Jewish Fighting Organization in Warsaw engaged in guerrilla warfare against the combined power of the German army, Ukrainian auxiliaries, and the SS. The Jewish Fighting Organization surprised the enemy before SS General Jürgen Stroop eventually switched to burning down the entire ghetto, one building at a time, finally crushing the revolt. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as the first mass revolt in a major city in Nazi-occupied Europe, became a symbol of Jewish resistance to Nazi oppression, inspiring similar revolts in Białystok and Minsk, as well as uprisings in Treblinka and Sobibor later in 1943. The Jewish fighters in Warsaw, under-equipped and overmatched, with few weapons and almost no training, isolated and surrounded by an indifferent and often hostile population, malnourished and diseased, managed to hold off the German forces for as long as the entire Polish army had in the invasion of Poland at the beginning of the war. But it was not enough. While it has often been assumed that the politicization of the revolt took place in the aftermath of the war, the fierce battle for credit over the revolt took place within the first weeks and months after the uprising, and in many respects was guided by reports emanating from the ghetto by surviving members of the Jewish Fighting Organization and the Jewish National Committee on the Aryan side of Warsaw. There was a particular narrative of the Warsaw Ghetto and the revolt that began to emerge during the war itself, and this would play a central role in shaping post-war memory of the revolt. It was this battle for credit that would ultimately transform the interpretation of the uprising from a revolt representing a broad cross-section of the remaining Jewish population of Warsaw into a battle led by a small elite cadre of Zionist youth engaged in a fight that would be interpreted after the war as a fight on the road to the creation of the Jewish state. My remarks this evening will examine the ways in which the memory of the uprising was mobilized by the Zionist movement, often in direct opposition to what we'll learn about the Jewish Socialist Labor Bund, even as the Zionist movement debated how to best incorporate the doomed struggle of Warsaw's Jews into its Zionist worldview. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising would become the focal point of Holocaust memory in the aftermath of the Shoah, in both Israel and America, with the date of April 19th, that is the date of the outbreak of the revolt, used to mark Holocaust commemorations annually beginning already in 1944. On the 5th anniversary of the revolt, the famous Rappaport Monument, which you can see here, was dedicated in Warsaw. Here's the monument, the front and the back of the monument, which I'll come back to. And in 1951, Israel's Knesset designated the 27th of Nisan on the Jewish calendar, 13 days after the uprising began, so as to not conflict with the holiday of Passover. The revolt began on the first night of Passover. Yom HaShoah was designated as the official date of Holocaust remembrance. On April 19th, 1951, a statue of Mordechai Anelevich was unveiled at Kibbutz Yad Mordechai. The Negev kibbutz bearing his name and a commemorative stamp bearing his image was also released. In 1953, the Knesset passed the Yad Vashem law on the 10th anniversary of the revolt. And here you can see, this is again the monument itself, Rappaport's monument dedicated on the 5th anniversary, and the image of Anilevich, which we'll come back to, the focal point of the monument and the heroization of the revolt. So how was it that news of the revolt began to spread during the war, and how was it shaped by the context of that time? And I want us to think about this as we think about how we receive news and information and how we filter that through frameworks that are existing for understanding what's happening in the world. On April 24th, 1943, April 23rd, 1943, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, so this is 4 days after the outbreak of the revolt, delivered news of the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, relaying a report received in Stockholm the day before with a headline, "Nazis start mass execution of Warsaw Jews on Passover, victims broadcast SOS." On the same day, Davar, which was the daily Hebrew publication of the Jewish labor movement in Palestine, published a story on the revolt with a headline that said, you can see here, Sherit HaPleita, the surviving remnant of the Jewish diaspora, defends itself, defense in the streets of Warsaw. Initial reporting in the newspaper of the Israel Workers' Movement, Davar, edited by one of the leaders of labor Zionism, paralleled reports that came out in the Forwards, the Jewish Daily Forward. Here you can see on the fourth day as well after the revolt, this headline that said that the Nazis are slaughtering the last remaining Jews in Warsaw. So again, right, we think about the fact that the revolt broke out on April 19th, and within the same week we're seeing front page coverage of what's happening in Warsaw. These headlines describe the fighting Jews of Warsaw as both the surviving remnant of the Jewish diaspora and as rebels fighting the Nazis. Like the Forward, Davar mistakenly assumed that there were trained officers from the Polish underground who had been sent into the ghetto to manage the defense there. This is not what happened, as we will learn. Coverage in the Jewish press continued to highlight the revolt, along with news on other fronts of the war effort. And by Monday, May 10th, the Jewish Daily Forward, the largest Jewish circulation daily in New York, 250,000 readers, added a new trope in its coverage of Warsaw, reporting on the Jüdische Helden von Walscha, the Jewish heroes of Warsaw. So how did the context of April 1943 shape Jewish public reception of the news? Jews in the free world entered 1943 with the news that European Jewry was facing complete annihilation. In order to break through the apathy of allied countries and fellow citizens, Jewish communities in the United States organized mass protests in an attempt to capture the attention of the public and of political leaders with desperate calls to rescue the surviving Jewish population. At the same time, growing awareness of the destruction of European Jewry turned such rallies into large-scale memorial ceremonies. Indeed, screaming headlines and memorial pageants like the We Will Never Die pageant marked the transition from calls for rescue to calls for commemoration. Simultaneous with the outbreak of the fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto on April 19, 1943, the other major news item that captured the attention of the world Jewish press was the ill-fated Bermuda Conference, convened in response to urgent demands to rescue what was left of European Jewry. In this sense, the timing of the revolt was critical. It coincided with a moment of Jewish realization of the mass destruction of European Jewry and anger at the apathy of the surrounding world. An intense feeling, as you can see here, this was an advertisement taken out in the New York Times, an intense feeling of powerlessness to stop the destruction and arouse the conscience of the so-called civilized world while transitioning to memorializing the destruction of the Jewish communities of Europe. As the Jewish press began the search for the Jewish heroes of Warsaw, with reports indicating that the fighting there was winding down, reporting on Warsaw and the Bermuda Conference shifted to a new focus, the death of the Bundist activist in London, Shmuel Ziegelboim. And here you can see in the forwards also, Shmuel Ziegelboim tot in London. Shmuel Ziegelboim is dead in London. Ziegelboim had been a prominent Polish interwar Bundist, the leader of the Jewish socialist movement in Warsaw. After leaving Warsaw for New York, he became the Bund's representative in the Polish National Council in London, an advisory committee to the Polish government in exile. Upon hearing news of the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto in the aftermath of the uprising in the spring of 1943, Ziegelboim committed suicide in protest over the world's lack of action to prevent the mass murder of the Jews. And here you can see this is his obituary in the New York Times from May of 1943. In contrast to what were glowing tributes to Ziegelboim in the Yiddish and socialist press, the labor Zionist press was disparaging of Ziegelboim's choice to commit suicide. On May 21st, 1943, eulogy written in the labor Zionist Davar wrote disparagingly of Ziegelboim and his choice to commit suicide or die al Kiddush Hashem, to sanctify God's name, much, as they noted, like the head of the Judenrat, Adam Chernyakov, who had committed suicide before the Great Deportations began from the Warsaw Ghetto in July of 1942. By the end of May, the Forverts published an article on May 29th offering further detail on who the actual leaders of the revolt had been. They wrote 200 Jews led thousands of young people, older men, women, and children, radicals, Orthodox, and other groups in battle against the Nazis, noting that while it's impossible to discover the truth, it's clear that a great bloody battle has taken place. By the end of May 1943, so here we are 6 weeks after the revolt, further details on the dramatic fighting in Warsaw began to emerge. May 24th, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency reported that there were secret reports delivered to the British Parliament, to Ignacy Schwarzbart of the World Jewish Congress and Shmuel Ziegelboim, including secret communiques drafted by Jews outside the ghetto detailing what had happened in the first 10 days of the revolt. These two cables would add further detail to the dramatic saga of the revolt and clarified that, quote, particularly stiff resistance was put up by several thousand Jews who barricaded themselves in the underground storehouses of the ghetto. And indeed, what they were referencing was the fact that Jews had built bunkers inside the Warsaw Ghetto between the end of the Great Deportation in September of 1942. The 40 to 50,000 remaining Jews prepared themselves for what they thought would be the final liquidation by building bunkers and underground hideouts under the ghetto. And as these reports detail, after 9 days of bombardment and siege, with an estimated 1,000 Nazis killed, the reports added the heroic resistance of the Warsaw Ghetto continues, with a few strongholds holding out. The reports also began to fill in crucial details of the heroic fighting. And one of the things that's remarkable that we can see here in the early coverage of the revolt is comparisons to prior events in Jewish history. So very quickly we see Warsaw being compared to Masada, and this trope repeats itself. Masada, the Masada of Warsaw has fallen. The Nazis have set fire to the remnants of the Warsaw Ghetto. This was reported in Israel in Yediot Achronot, where the head of the Jewish National Committee saying the Jews of Warsaw made their last stand today, abandoned and alone. They have sanctified the name of their tortured and downtrodden people with their blood and renewed the tradition of the zealots of Jerusalem and Masada, the heroes of Bar Kokhba and other Jewish struggles. In fact, it's very commonplace within Jewish history for Jews to look back to prior historical events as part of a process of collective memory and create these associations to current events with this collective memorialization. In these reports, which were relayed through the telegrams and the secret cables, we also see beginning to fill in crucial details on the heroic fighting and identifying something that had not been identified until then, the existence of a, quote, Jewish fighting organization, which showed real ingenuity and courage. And in these reports, offering a name of a leader of the underground organization. The name's not one that we're going to expect. The name was, in fact, the name of someone by the name of Michal Klepfish. Klepfish, the report said, was an engineer, one of the pillars of the determined resistance. He died like a hero. At the same time, as news of deaths and names of heroes began to emerge, memorial services were organized. And in the Yishuv in Palestine, the Jewish settlement in Palestine, Tzivia Lubetkin and Tosia Altman, two leaders of Zionist youth movements in Poland, were eulogized in June of 1943 after it was believed that they had both died in the uprising. as the leader of the socialist Zionist Shomer Tzair, Meir Yaari, said, "These two women saved our dignity. They are legends." Now, at the time that they were eulogized, they were in fact both alive. Tzivia had survived by escaping through the sewers under Warsaw to escape from the burning ghetto. Tosia was also part of that group that escaped from the burning ghetto through the sewers. Tosia died 2 weeks later in a fire in a safe house outside the ghetto. Tzivia would survive and live to tell her story. On June 3rd, 1943, so here you can see, this is Tosia Altman, who we'll come back to, and this is Tzivia Lubetkin. On June 3rd, so here we are, less than 2 months afterwards, the London's Evening Standard proposed that April 19th of every year should be a so-called Jewish Day. And they wrote in the Evening Standard, April 19th, the day when human valor converted the Warsaw Ghetto into a fortress of freedom, should be an honored day among men cherishing mercy and tolerance. Jews are fighting today on all fronts for the cause of humanity, and the Jew will be among the proud participants of common victory. We can come back to this idea, right? The idea of Jews participating in the war effort to fight for freedom. 2 weeks later, on June 16th, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency reported on a planned mass meeting in New York to commemorate the Jewish heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto. The Jewish Labor Committee organized a Saturday evening, June 19th mass meeting at Carnegie Hall to honor and celebrate the heroes, featuring a number of speakers, including the Polish ambassador, the president of the American Jewish Congress, the chairman of the Jewish Labor Committee, and others. Lucy Schildkreuz, later to be Lucy Davidovich, recalled, one of the great historians of the Holocaust of the previous generation, recalled the June 19th, 1943 service in her memoirs, going to Carnegie Hall 2 months after the revolt. "We went and we wept, yet there was pride in what the Polish Jews had done. For the first time anywhere during the German occupation of Europe, a civilian population had taken up arms against their German oppressors. Not just any civilian population, but the most oppressed, the most helpless, the most desperate. In the next weeks, Bundist and Zionist underground reports from Warsaw reaching the West gave details of the fighting and listed the names of the dead and the few survivors. The events of Warsaw burned into my consciousness. The Warsaw Ghetto became a constant part of my internal life. I used to imagine myself there, test myself as to how I would have behaved. Would I have had the courage to fight? Would I have had the stamina against despair?" Writing in the labor Zionist publication in the United States, The Jewish Frontier, Marie Sirkin, some of you might be familiar with that name, she later would write Blessed is the Match, the first book in English to describe Jewish resistance during the war. She also wrote in July of 1943 of a desire to know the identities of the heroes. She wrote, "We do not know the names of the heroes, and we cannot pin medals on their breasts, even posthumously. But here and there, a figure emerges. We all know the names of Chernyakov, the head of the Jewish Council, and of Ziegelboim, who killed himself in London in protest against the indifference of the world. To these names, we can now add that of Tzivia Lubetkin, the mother. Tzivia, the mame, was not old, nor did she have children of her own. She lost her life at the age of 28 as a leader of the ghetto's final battle. Young as she was the mother, by virtue of strength and solicitude, of the crushed, the abandoned, the helpless." And Sirkin would go on in the same account to 3 months after the revolt, and she would say, "There's another circumstance we must note. The defenders in the ghetto raised a flag to fly from the ghetto wall. It was the Jewish flag, the Star of Zion. The badge of shame became a banner, and the strength which transformed it, the strength of Tzivia and her comrades, came from the most ancient well as the newest source of Jewish strength, Zion." What Sirkin did not know at the time, however, was that Lubetkin had in fact survived. A group of approximately 40 surviving ghetto fighters had managed to sneak out of the ghetto through the sewers under the Warsaw Ghetto on May 10th, 1943. This young man on the left, you can see here, Simcha Rotem, codenamed Kazik, that was his underground name. had escaped from the ghetto, and on May 1st, so within the first 2 weeks, had escaped to the outside of the Warsaw Ghetto through a tunnel and connected with Yitzchak Antek Zuckerman, the deputy commander of the Jewish Fighting Organization, to see if there was some plan to help them escape from the ghetto. This was not something that the fighting organization had planned for. The assumption was that they would fight until the death. And when it became clear that Jürgen Stroop and the SS just planned to simply burn down the ghetto, it was clear that there was no way to fight the fire, that if they were to live and to tell their story, there had to be a way to escape from the ghetto. And so Kazik spent a week outside the ghetto trying to work together with Yitzchak Antek Zuckerman, who is in the back of this picture taken in occupied Warsaw in late 1943, trying to figure out a way back into the ghetto. They're able to get some Polish sewage workers to show them how to get underground on the sewers under the Warsaw Ghetto. They emerge from, just Kazik emerges from a manhole cover inside the Warsaw Ghetto, stumbles around in the darkness amongst the ruins, somehow manages to connect with Tzivi Lebetkin and Marek Edelman, two of the commanders in the Jewish Fighting Organization, and they rescue whoever's left from the Mila 18 bunker where Mordechai Nilevich died after the Germans gassed the bunker. They rescue whoever's left from there, and together about 40 of them manage to crawl out of the ghetto for 2 days through the sewers underneath Warsaw. For those who have been to Warsaw, you can see this is the monument at 51 Prosta Street, where they crawled out of the sewers and managed to arrange for trucks to take them out to the woods outside of Warsaw. Once they had regrouped on the Aryan side of Warsaw, hiding in an apartment less than 2 weeks after the revolt, Tzivia and her boyfriend Antek, so here's Tosia Altman, here's Tzivi Lebetkin, Yitzchak Zuckerman was her boyfriend, later husband. Later, they became the founders of the Ghetto Fighters kibbutz in Israel, near Akko. They began to draft letters, and they drafted a telegram to the leaders of the Zionist movement in Palestine, informing them of the end of the Warsaw Ghetto fighting. In a June 15, 1943 letter, to the leaders of their youth movements, they offered an initial description of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and emphasized the central role played by members of their own movements, including Mordechai Nilevich, Tosi Altman, and others. And in the weeks and months after the uprising, the surviving ghetto fighters and activists on the Jewish National Committee engaged in a frenzy of activity. They were organizing relief work for the Jews who had survived the revolt or were in hiding outside of the ghetto. They were trying to rescue whichever Jews could be saved. And at the same time, they started drafting reports of the uprising, writing reports to tell their story in case they didn't survive so that the world would know what had happened. As Melech Noy would note 1 year later after the uprising in the book Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, most of the initial accounts of the revolt were based on smuggled letters and reports that had to be then filled out with conjecture and imagination. And so over the course of 1943, once the fighters managed to find shelter on the Aryan side of Warsaw, they worked to establish connections with the outside world, secure the funding that they needed to continue their relief work, and write the first draft of history to convey information on what had happened. And one of the things that's quite interesting, so you can see here, Tuvia Buzhakovsky, one of the members of the Jewish Fighting Organization. These are his papers. This is Stefan Grajek, also one of the members of the Jewish Fighting Organization. This is Marek Edelman from the Jewish Labor Bund, the Socialist Labor Bund, after the war, pointing out to visitors from the United States where the Mila 18 bunker was. And one of the things that's quite interesting, these are members of different political organizations. Before World War II, the Zionists and the Jewish Socialists had diametrically opposed political worldviews. The Zionists believed that the Jewish future needed to be in the land of Israel, and the Socialists believed that you could build a Jewish national culture in the diaspora and Yiddish national culture out of a shared identification with the socialist working classes. They were diametrically opposed. So the fact that they came together to fight together in the Warsaw Ghetto by itself was incredibly important. And what's also important is that in the initial reports that these groups send out, reports written by the Jewish Fighting Organization, the Jewish National Committee, and the Jewish Workers Underground and the Bund, they emphasized the fraternal nature of the collaboration between the members of the Jewish Fighting Organization, something which they described as a solidarity forged in the heat of battle, and that this solidarity continued in the period after the uprising and in hiding on the Aryan side. And you can see here, they say fighters belong to almost all of the ideological movements, and even though we swam in different streams and different currents, we were united by a fight for life, not for life, but to the death, by the fight for the honor and dignity of the Jewish people. Leon Feiner, who was chairman of the Jewish Socialist Bund's Central Committee, described the spirit in this way. He described it as an esprit de guerre, a spirit of sacrifice, courage, revenge, and dignity, a manifestation of the will to atone with dignity for having been ensnared by the Nazis' deceits, to fight for dignity, and to fight uncompromisingly against fascism on behalf of the New World. Sorry, I just clicked something. Okay. Already in June of 1943, we can also see something else taking place, which is the difficulty of describing the magnitude of this historic event to people in the outside world who simply could not understand it. As the Bund wrote in June of 1943, what was going on in April and May of Warsaw, that Jewish-German war that they named the Battle of Ghettograd, this really does surpass any analogy from history, either of our own or any other nation. The unforgettable, deeply moving images of the ghetto, enwrapped in clouds of smoke, lit by the enormous glow of blazing fires, the staccato clatter of machine guns, the roar of howitzers, the pandemonium of heavy artillery, exploding mines, crashing buildings, people of ours living amidst the inferno. It seems that there is no master of pen, brush, or sound who could represent in full the great event which was happening before our eyes. Neither could he express what we all experience in those terrible, tragic, and yet great days. And we have to remember, right, these are young people, products of youth movements without military training, amazed by what they have been able to pull off, that is holding off the mighty German military for weeks, right? And so we have to understand that as we're reading these accounts. Highlighting the fraternity in battle, they explain that the nature of their cooperation was organized to prepare for armed resistance. In the Bundist report, they also noted that our outstanding contribution was supplying the Jewish Fighting Organization with explosives and the production of the ammunition for active resistance here in the ghetto. In this respect, the services of Comrade Michael Klepfish, an engineer, were invaluable. He was killed in the last battle. In addition, we increased considerably the funds of the Coordinating Commission and the Jewish Fighting Organization. As they wrote in their report, and this is the first report to make it to London and to New York, this is important, right? Who tells the story first? While the Germans had suffered tremendous casualties, they noted that the casualties suffered by the resistance organization were comparatively small, but many of its best members, including its commander-in-chief, and here they wrote the name of the commander-in-chief, M. Ordcha, Hashomer, engineer Klepfish, armament chief Barak, and others fell in the fight. And then a later account, which they sent in November, included a list of names of all of the ghetto fighters. And then later somebody went through and they listed which movements they all belonged to. Because very quickly it became important to make sure that it was noted which movements had participated in the revolt. And so you can see here the names written down. The Bund in New York publishes a book called Ghetto in Flames, Ghetto in Flammen, already in 1944, taking credit for its role. By April 19th, 1944, so here we are now a year after the revolt, as had been called for less than 2 months after the uprising, the date of April 19th would become an anniversary to hold memorial services around the world. And on April 19th, 1944, over 30,000 Jews gathered in New York City before the steps of City Hall to hear speeches by Mayor LaGuardia and prominent Jewish leaders. As was reported in the Vorwärts, hundreds of thousands of Jews in New York honored the Jewish heroes and martyrs of Poland with sorrowful demonstrations, marches to City Hall with the participation of the mayor. The New York Times would write at the time that the Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto was, quote, an example of courage that history can scarcely match, noting that all faiths and creeds thrill at the heroic story. Among those pictured here behind Mayor LaGuardia and Rabbi Rosenstein from Vilna on the steps of the City Hall in New York were the poet Julian Tuwim and the artist Arthur Szyk. The Polish-Jewish artist Arthur Szyk, who had arrived in New York in 1940 and almost single-handedly led an artistic effort to convince the American public to support the war effort, created a work called The Repulsed Attack to commemorate the first anniversary of the revolt. And you can see here, so this was published broadly in the Yiddish press on the first anniversary of the revolt. And what's interesting is in this illustration, in his typical detailed, illuminated style, Szyk did not depict any female fighters. There's a little boy on the left with payas, but they're all male fighters, even though by then the names of Tosia Altman, Tzivi Lubetkin, Topsha Davidovich, and others had been reported in various places. But in this work of art, we can see that he does represent the revolt as a popular uprising, representing a cross-section of the Jewish population, young and old, religious and secular, middle class and working class among the Jewish fighters. So I want us to think again about the notion that there's thousands of Jews burying themselves underground in bunkers, helping to facilitate the revolt, versus an image of the revolt led by an elite few fighters. And we can already see this sort of dueling images beginning to play out. At the same time as Jews in New York and in London are marking the first anniversary, comparatively in the Yishuv in Palestine, the Jewish settlement in Palestine, the celebrations, or the commemorations, I should say, were more muted in comparison. Days of fasting were proclaimed, work ceased, and public rallies took place. But it seems that without the knowledge of who was responsible for organizing the revolt, it was more difficult for the Zionist movement to celebrate the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto. And so in this regard, it's incredibly important for us to pay attention to the role that letters and reports emerging from occupied Warsaw during the war played in crafting a specific memory of the revolt. There is a great deal of frustration among the Jews in Warsaw that there's silence, that they're not hearing from their comrades in the Yishuv, from the leaders of the Zionist movement in Palestine. They urgently need more funding to continue their relief work. And even at the same time, they are beginning to write up a history of their efforts and the history of the Jewish Fighting Organization, which will become probably the most prominent of the reports that shapes the way that the history is then subsequently written. This report of the report of the Jewish Fighting Organization can now today be found in the Ghetto Fighters House archives in Polish, Yiddish, and Hebrew. It becomes the basis for later reports in subsequent books. It's excerpted in Lucy Dawidowicz's Holocaust Reader and Yisrael Gutman's Jews of Warsaw. And taken together with the reports of the Jewish Workers Underground that were written in the spring of 1944, this detailed account of the Jewish Fighting Organization constituted the first attempt to write the history of the resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. This report was largely crafted by Yitzchak Antek Zuckerman, and he wrote this report partly pulling together testimonies of different ghetto fighters who had survived the revolt, and wrote this account of the Jewish Fighting Organization. Zuckerman's account of the Jewish Fighting Organization was part of a larger shipment that was sent out of the Warsaw Ghetto in May of 1944 by the Jewish National Committee and the Bund, working together, who sent a file of underground documents to their colleagues in London for publication in the West. Letters, reports, surveys, diaries, testimonies, and poems. And this May 1944 package of 120 pages was smuggled on microfilm. So this is at the Ghetto Fighters House in Israel. They have a copy of the microfilm case. And it really is a treasure trove of items that were smuggled out of Warsaw to tell the story of the doomed ghetto and the incredible work of dedicated activists after the liquidation of the ghetto to preserve what remained of Jewish Warsaw. Included in this materials were the last words of notable Jewish activists in the ghetto who had managed to survive the uprising, but would not survive the year that followed. Perhaps most notably was what would become known as the last letter of Emanuel Ringelblum, the famous historian of the Warsaw Ghetto who created the Oyneg Shabbos, the underground archive, and who, as noted by his colleague Adolf Berman, was killed 1 week after the final draft of their letter was written to be smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto. This last letter from Ringelblum and Berman was received in London and New York in May of 1944, and it went through various drafts. And I won't go into it now, but one of the interesting things about archival research is when you look at drafts of a letter like this, you can see how certain words change in the way in which these letters are written. So, for example, the way that the last letter, which becomes known as "To Live with Honor and to Die with Honor," describes the revolt as being heading the struggle, our heroic youth of all orientations, with those faithful to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, in the forefront. And when we go into the archive and we look at the different versions of the letter that emerge, we see that in an earlier version of the letter, before the final one that was sent out, Ringelblum and Berman wrote, "The struggle was carried out first and foremost by courageous youths from all the youth movements and an organized part of the proletariat." The revised letter emphasized the role played by the leading members of the Zionist movements. And it seems that one of the aspects of what happened here is that Adolf Berman would revise and edit sources for political reasons. And there's no reason to doubt that in this case, in response to a distinct feeling that the surviving members of the Jewish fighting organization in the Warsaw Ghetto had, which was that the Bund, the Jewish socialists abroad, were taking credit disproportionately for the revolt, they had to rewrite the letter in such a way to state in no uncertain terms that those faithful to Eretz Yisrael stood at the forefront of the fighting. And we can see this in other cases. And it's true, according to the historical record, I just want to point out, there were 22 different battalions that formed the fighting organization. 18 of them came from Zionist movements. A smaller group of them came from the Bund. So they were very concerned that their story was not being told in the broader world. But it's really, for a historian, it's really fascinating to see how this history gets shaped in the sources that are written at the time. I'll skip over this. You could see, for example, the famous last letter of Mordechai Analevich that then gets reprinted. And some of this material is printed even during the war in an account written by Melech Neustadt called The Warsaw Ghetto Rising, in which he, in the Yishuv, as one of the leaders of the Zionist movement in Palestine, also felt a need to set the record straight and make sure that it was clear that it was the Zionist movement that played the leading role in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. The Bund, Neustadt charged in this account, continued to pervert the facts of this sacred and wonderful event, noting that they selected only the names of 36 Bundists from that list of 223 Jewish fighters killed in the uprising, while not paying attention to the 187 others, 150 of whom were members of the Zionist socialist movement. Neustadt also criticized the Bund for taking credit for leading the uprising, with Klepfish cited as the leader, when it was clear that no more than 18% of the fighters in the Jewish fighting organization were Bundists. He disputed the Bundist claim that Klepfish was in fact the leader of the uprising and sought to set the record straight with what was previously unknown information. He wrote, "This also led to the regrettable error when the name of Michal Klepfish, a member of the Bund, a brave and loyal fighter who lost his life in the ghetto fighting, was publicized as the central figure of the rising. The real leader was in fact Mordechai Analevich, a member of Hashomer Tzair. His second in command was Isaac Z." Here we know it's Yitzchak Zuckerman that he's referencing. Isaac Z, who at the time was still in occupied Warsaw, one of the heads of the pioneering Zionist youth movement in Poland. When we received the initial reports, he said, we received a report that said Mordechai, quote, was the father of the defense. As we did not know which Mordechai was meant, could have been Mordechai Tenenbaum, who had been both in Warsaw and then led the revolt in Białystok, we did not publish this news but asked for further details. In the meantime, there was a telegram from the Polish Telegraphic Agency publicizing the name of Michał Klepfish. While acknowledging how important Klepfish was as an engineer in the manufacture of homemade weapons in the ghetto, Neustadt was able to now concretely advance the fact that the M.Ordcha, referred to in the Bundes report, M.Ordcha, if you take out the period, says Mordcha, was none other than Mordechai Nalevich, previously unknown outside Poland, who would become known as the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And indeed, in the next 2 years, Neustadt would dedicate himself to publishing the accounts and the testimonies of the Zionist ghetto fighters in the ghetto in competition with the Jewish Labor Bund, which would publish the accounts of its own fighters. We can see then clearly that the brotherhood of the fighters did not extend to New York and to Tel Aviv. Beyond emerging disagreements over who played a leading role in the revolt, one of the key questions that would divide Zionists from Bundist accounts of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising were questions of historical interpretation. Was the revolt a popular revolt, led by a broad cross-section of the Jewish public in the Warsaw Ghetto, or was it a Zionist revolt? Was it a reflection of the Polish Jewish will to fight back, or was it a small cadre of the Zionist avant-garde who sensed the need to overthrow the yoke of Nazi oppression because of their connection to the land of Israel? More fundamentally, how was armed resistance framed in the political sphere after the revolt? And what role did the surviving ghetto fighters themselves play in shaping the ways in which resistance would be understood and interpreted in the aftermath of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? One thing also became clear in the first year after the revolt. It was the surviving ghetto fighters themselves who would have to play a critical role in writing their own 3 lines in history. By the 5th anniversary of the revolt, April 19, 1948, had already become the date to commemorate Jewish suffering and Jewish heroism. On this date, Natan Rapoport's monument to the ghetto fighters was dedicated in Warsaw. Natan Rapoport, who had been a member of Shomer HaTzair and had survived the war in the Soviet Union, returning to Warsaw with the Red Army after liberation, was adamant that the monument be placed on the site of the revolt where Analevich had died in his bunker. And I want to just point out, if you look at this picture, this is a picture from the 5th anniversary of the revolt. This is the dedication of what would become this famous monument in the Warsaw Ghetto we can still visit today. And I just want you to see, right? So you have the crowds gathered there, and you can see all the rubble behind it, right? Warsaw completely destroyed. There's nothing there. So one of the first structures that will be erected is this monument, right? And we can spend more time talking about the monument and this event as well. After the war, the symbolic power of the revolt would be marshaled by the Zionist movement to support the struggle for the creation of the Jewish state after the Shoah. And indeed, by 1946, 47, 48, we see very clearly among surviving youth in the DP camps, for example, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising becomes a very prominent symbol, right? The Jewish people after the war must immigrate to the land of Israel. Zionism is the only conclusion for the Jewish people after the Holocaust, and this becomes an incredibly powerful symbol, right, for survivors after the war. After the war, the symbolic power of the revolt will be marshaled by the Zionist movement to support the struggle for the creation of the Jewish state after the Shoah. The Jewish heroes of Warsaw would be cast in stone as actors who burst forth from the ghetto to alter the course of history. On the back of the monument, the Jewish masses would recede back into the depths of the ghetto. Thank you. So I think we have time for questions, and I believe there's going to be a roving microphone running around. So feel free to raise your hand, and then
So if you want to see. I'll always ask a question. Hello? Hi, thank you so much. I'm just curious, the last photo you showed with the rubble behind, what does that look like today? I don't know. I've never been
okay.
there.
So the question was looking at the Warsaw Ghetto with all the rubble behind it. What does it look like today? So I wish I could pull up a contemporary picture just to show you, but just to give you a sense, I mean, Warsaw, the area of the ghetto, is completely rebuilt. In many places in that ghetto area, kind of in a Soviet style, so anyway, with apartment blocks, et cetera. There is a wide plaza facing the Warsaw Ghetto, the Ghetto Fighters Monument. And today, opposite that wide plaza where this monument is the Polin Museum, which is the Museum of 1,000 Years of Jewish History in Poland, an incredible museum, which actually when you walk into that museum, you descend underground into the depths of the ghetto, essentially. The monument itself, so I mentioned that Rappaport wanted to put it at the site of Mila 18, and they couldn't put it at Mila 18 because on the first year after, on April 19th, 1946, another monument had already been put at Mila 18, which you can still go see. So on the rubble of Mila 18, you walk up the steps, there is a stone monument there. And actually right now, for the last year or so, there's been an archaeological excavation going on, because you would imagine, right, as soon as you start excavating under the Warsaw Ghetto, you find all sorts of things that can help us in understanding the history of the Holocaust, and it's being excavated there to see what we can find where the bunker of the Jewish Fighting Organization was.
Please just raise your hand and Spencer will bring them up.
Struck by the juxtaposition of you had to these two sides of the monument. Because the first side, the more famous monument, seems to me to be reminiscent of other artwork I've seen, especially with the woman behind with the breath showing. It strikes me as almost, dare I say, fascist.
Yeah.
And in juxtaposition to the other side, which strikes me as being very humble, very diasporic. And so it just strikes me as it struck me that way. And I know that was very controversial saying that, but I had to say it because it especially with the one woman with the breast showing, with the history that you gave about the women and their involvement, because that's not showing that, is it? It's showing something else, you know.
So, yeah, I'm glad that you bring this up. I mean, it's really something so I write about in the book. It's quite fascinating to look at what Rappaport does with this monument. And I'll go back here for a second so we can also get a sense for the bigger picture of the monument, because there's so many symbols that are embedded into the story of this monument. So first of all, right, James Young writes about the monument. James Young, who's a historian of the Holocaust and an expert on monuments and memorials, he, in his description of the monument, says that Rappaport actually created, so you can see sort of the wall behind the front side of the monument, which I'll talk about in a second. He says Rappaport created that actually to evoke the Western Wall in Jerusalem, which, if we think about this idea of this sort of being a new Wailing Wall or a new Western Wall at the temple in Jerusalem, but creating kind of a new holy site, right? It's very interesting to think about what Rappaport is trying to do here. What you can't see in this picture, I want to see if you can see it in this picture. No, you can't. There are also two menorahs which you can't see here because of the crowds are blocking it. 2 menorahs that are there that are meant to evoke the great synagogue that was destroyed, that had 2 menorahs in front of it. And then, yes, so this, right, this is in some sense emerges from, I wouldn't, it also the Soviet Union also had sort of monuments like that, so I wouldn't label it as evoking one political movement or another. But what I will say is that this does emerge from like this monumental style of architecture that is very kind of attempt to create like these heroic figures. And it's very clear that this figure of a slightly emaciated, right? So you can see the slightly emaciated ghetto fighter in the center, who is modeled on Ilevich, is the center point, the heroic figure in the monument. And then, yes, as you point out, right, like you have an older fighter on the bottom who is kind of grasping for a stone, which is what he's going to use. The Anilevich has the right arm bandage and is holding like a hand grenade in his left arm. He's at the center, and then everyone is surrounding him, young or older, and then the woman with the breast bared, right? And then fire, which is to symbolize the fire that is taking place in the ghetto. Just as a side note, for those of you who have been to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, this is also the center of the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial Plaza, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, where the monument is shown side by side instead of front and back. And the woman's breast is covered at Yad Vashem, out of sort of sensitivity, to religious sensitivities, right? But to your point also about the idea that the fighters are bursting forth from the stone, I think that there is something about this idea that the act of organizing the revolt was an act of Jewish fighters taking control over their own destiny as actors with agency bursting forth from the stone, emerging into the historical record. And I think Rappaport was very conscious of this juxtaposition. These are people of action. These are passive individuals being marched to their deaths. And we could talk about sort of what that symbolizes and represents. I don't think it's a fair representation, but this is how he creates the monument. And on the back side, so the fact that they're bursting forth is magnified by the fact that these sort of representations of Jewish passivity being marched to the Umschlagplatz, where the Jewish masses were then deported to Treblinka, right, they recede. So as much as they recede, the fighters on the front burst forth, and they're sort of an interplay between them. And one of the things that I write about in the book is that there is this paradox, right? For the fighters to burst forth, it has to sort of present the rest of the Jewish population as passive. And actually, this is not an accurate reflection of what actually happened. So the truth is, so I mentioned in the accounts of the revolt, thousands of Jews burrowing themselves underground in bunkers and storehouses under the ghetto. And that's exactly what happened. There's about 40 to 50,000 Jews remaining in the Warsaw Ghetto in the spring of 1943. A few hundred fighters who actually have weapons. The vast majority of the Jews, and the Jewish Fighting Organization tells them, hide underground, build bunkers, do not let them take you. We know now that if they take you, they're taking you to Treblinka, they're going to gas you, right? Do not let them take you. And the truth is that one of the reasons that the revolt lasted so long is it took the Germans a long time to pull the people out of the bunkers, right? And the fire is what forced people to come out of the bunkers. So, some historians argue, actually, what leads to the success of the revolt is the people hiding underground refusing to be deported, right? So it's really interesting then to think about, like, who's a hero? What do we celebrate? Do we emphasize armed resistance, or do we emphasize other kinds of resistance? Sure, yeah.
Thank you. I'm curious if there are stories, I know we speak about youth, we're speaking really primarily with people in their 20s.
Right.
Are there any stories that you have come across much younger, youth who were involved in the uprising?
Yeah, so let me go back to some of these pictures just to, sorry, I'll just represent, I'll go back to some of these pictures. I mean, this is a really interesting, and when I talk about this with my students, for example, so, I think one of the things that we have to emphasize, right, so Tosia Altman, okay, so she's 25, right? And the leaders of the revolt are mainly products of the youth movements who have graduated from sort of leadership training. Look, here's Kajik, right? He's also part of the Socialist Zionist youth movement. He's like 17 at this time, right? So I think that's really important for us to emphasize, right? That it is young people who take the lead in organizing the resistance. And there's a lot of factors that go into this. The parental generation are the ones who are most likely to, first of all, be co-opted into serving on Jewish councils and taking those sort of roles in the position in the ghetto. But also, and teachers, we could talk about this. I talk about this with my students. Young people are much more likely to take risks. They're much more likely, they are not married, they don't have children, they're not thinking about the fate of their families. They're much more likely to say, I'm just living for myself in this moment, and what we need to do is fight back, and we have to revolt, and the parental generation is wrong because they're not fighting back, they're taking too much responsibility. And it's an interesting thing to emphasize, right? Like, for example, somebody like Tosia, who was really involved in HaShomer Tzair, her role in the fighting organization was she was an underground courier. So she would travel with a hidden identity, pretending to be a Polish Christian woman, because her Polish was perfect and she was fluent and she could pass as a non-Jew. And she would travel between the ghettos, spreading information she's the one who travels from Vilna in the beginning of 1942 back to Warsaw to relay the reports of this is what's happening. Everything's quiet in Warsaw, but they are engaged in mass murder. They're shooting hundreds of thousands of Jews in the East. This is what's happening. And without somebody with the courage to travel between the ghettos, to bring information, to bring false documents, to smuggle in weapons, right, which is very often women, young women who do this, right, the underground wouldn't be successful. So I'm glad you bring that up, because you notice this as you see the pictures, an important element of this story.
Did any of them be brought to Auschwitz or Birkenau?
Yes. You asked if any of them were brought to Auschwitz?
From Warsaw.
Yeah. So what happens after the revolt, and this is interesting. A lot of the Jews, the sort of wider population who are captured, a number of them are actually rounded up and brought to concentration camps. So there's a large group that's brought to Majdanek, which is near Lublin. Some do end up in Auschwitz. And some of the survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising don't survive in the way that I described, but survive first being rounded up and then taken to concentration camps, surviving to the end of the war, and also telling their story.
Hi. Okay. Hi. My name's Andrea. So I'm an educator here. I'm in the Holocaust training program. So first, I'll say that my framework is that my grandparents survived the Holocaust. I've always really wanted to learn more about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I feel like I'm very, very inspired by it. And for some reason, like information about Holocaust, what I've learned about, like maybe glossed over it. So I really appreciate your presentation. I definitely want to learn more about it because it's like a name, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and I don't, before tonight, really feel like I knew much more of the details, so I appreciate that. I did not go to Warsaw this summer, but I was able to go to the Nazi ammunition factory that my grandmother was imprisoned in when she was about 10. This was in Poland. And I also was able to go to Auschwitz this summer, where my other grandmother also spent time. So I am connected to this topic in a very personal way. I guess I have two questions. One, you were saying a little bit, maybe like 2 questions ago, about like who do we name heroes? Who do we call the, rebels and resistance? I'm very interested in that. And then my other question is, are you, as a Holocaust scholar yourself, are you like following any of these Israeli Holocaust scholars like Raz Siegel and Professor Omer Bartov? So for people here that don't know these names, so Raz Siegel was on Democracy Now! He's an Israeli Holocaust scholar, and he's calling what's happening in Gaza a textbook case of genocide. And Professor Omer Bartov, the article that I was reading is called Clear Intention of Ethnic Cleansing. These are really obviously disturbing phrases that we're using. And to be clear, this is, these statements are Israeli forces, the perpetuation of violence in Gaza at the hands of Israeli forces. And so, yeah, I guess I hope my question is clear, but to reiterate, as a Holocaust scholar yourself, can you comment? Do you, I know this is controversial, but like all of this is controversial. And, we are here when genocide is being perpetuated, not only in Gaza, but like there's 8 other genocides happening today.
Right.
So I bring this up in a spirit of open conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, thank you. So I'm glad you raised that question. I'll say first of all, so I know Raz, Raz. I know Omer, and so I've been paying very, very close attention to what they've been writing and these allegations. And so first of all, some of you might have seen, so Omer Bartov wrote something in the New York Times 2 weeks ago, what I believe is a historian of genocide. And actually, I have something that I wrote today, that was published today in Haaretz, that challenges everything that he said. So I disagree very strongly with his sort of assertion and I think it's actually quite irresponsible for somebody who's a very well-respected historian of the Holocaust, as Omer Bartov is, and with what he knows, to what he says in that article, or in that guest essay, which was in the New York Times 2 weeks ago, is that Israel has the potential to demonstrate genocidal intent. And then he connects it to statements by certain political leaders. And I think it's a very dangerous assertion to be made in this context without sort of evidence to support it. And I say that because genocide has a very specific definition, which is the intent to destroy members of a group in whole or in part as such. And I don't think that we can make what is a very inflammatory claim about a war and a military operation against a terrorist organization, even if, right, I don't want to minimize the horrific nature of the war and the fact that civilians are being killed, which should not happen, but it does not constitute genocide if you have civilians who are caught in the crossfire who are dying but are not being killed as members of a group as such. So I think it's important, and one of the things that a group of us wrote in this response to Bartov and Haaretz was that we don't think, like a historian, the tools of a historian are, we should write based on what we know, not what we believe. And what we know is based on evidence, and it's based on research, and it's not based on political beliefs. And I think in this case, he's critical of the Israeli government, he's critical of the leadership of the government, but I don't think he's basing his argument in evidence. So that's, yes, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and paying attention to it, and I'm very concerned about what some of my colleagues in the field are saying. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, hi. So you spoke of the urgency of the people that survived to communicate what had happened in the ghetto with the rest of the world. And it seemed like, I think, 3 or 4 days after it started, there were articles that were released in Palestine. And I think you showed us an article in Hebrew from something in the United States. But what about the mainstream newspapers in the United States, the New York Times, I don't even know, the Herald Tribune? And what was the timeline and what was the public response to such horrific news?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, you're right that I sort of focused more on the Jewish press. What's interesting about the wartime coverage, and some of you might be familiar with Laura Leff's book, Buried by the Times. You might have heard of that book, where she systematically goes through and looks at how the New York Times covered the Holocaust, or what we would refer to today as the Holocaust, but at the time we weren't using that, the term wasn't being used. And she argues that instead of making it front page news, what they would do, she said, Buried by the Times, was you would have these, because what I'm showing you is that there's a lot of information that's coming out. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency, for example, is writing a lot of reports. There's a lot more, so it's simply impossible for people to make the claim we didn't know what was happening. But what we can see is that the mainstream press would, while covering certain events, would also funnel a lot of its coverage about the destruction of European Jewry into the deeper recesses of the newspaper, right? And that's an editorial choice. That being said, there are certain events. So the Holocaust Museum in Washington has an exhibit called Americans in the Holocaust, which Ken Burns turned into the documentary The U.S. and the Holocaust. And what they did for that Americans in the Holocaust is they crowdsourced and they asked Americans all over the United States to send in, sort of like scan their newspapers in their archives and their libraries from 1933 to 1945. And what we find is that in small town newspapers and large newspapers across the United States, there's a lot of coverage of what's happening in Europe. So on the one hand, that shows us that people cannot claim they didn't know, because they know, but it actually is a little bit even more disturbing that people knew and still kind of felt like they could go on with the knowledge that these things were going on. The most famous example of this is Kristallnacht, so November 9th and 10th, the November pogrom in November 9th and 10th, 1938, when hundreds of synagogues were destroyed, thousands of Jewish homes were destroyed throughout the Reich, 25,000 Jews rounded up and taken to concentration camps, was front page news all over the United States. And Gallup did some polling afterwards, and they said, what do you think of what the Nazis are doing to the Jews? Something like 93% said, yes, we condemn the way that the Nazis are persecuting the Jews. And then they asked, are you in favor of changing U.S. immigration law to let in Jewish refugees? And over 3/4 of respondents said, no, we don't want to change, right? So we have to sit with that knowledge that people knew and still didn't want to do anything really to change, to bring in refugees. And in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, yes, there's some coverage initially, and then it sort of falls out of the front page. Right behind you, there's a question. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your illuminating lecture. I was wondering why you focus so much on this dispute between the Zionists and the Bund, the need to create named heroes. It seems that women were marginalized. As somebody sort of not involved in this story to the level of nuance that you are, why such a dispute? Why couldn't they all have risen up? It seems almost facile to say that one person was a leader, this person was a number two. You said there was about 200 fighters. I'm sure they were in different buildings. I'm sure there was a bunch of different leaderships. Why this obsession over who led it, who the heroes were, and one group being supreme over the other group in terms of that leadership, and the smaller group trying to claim they were the bigger group? If you could just sort of explain the politics of that to those of us who are not in the story as yours.
Sure. One of the reasons it's significant for us to see sort of how this plays out is it shows us the way in which the politicization of the memory of the revolt, the politicization of the writing of the history, shapes the way in which it's then subsequently interpreted and understood. So very quickly after the war, and this happens basically by 1945, so within 2 years after the revolt, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising becomes this very important symbol that is used by the surviving Jewish population in Europe, and in particular by the Zionist movement, to say what needs to happen now. This is a symbol of the connection that the Jewish people have to the land of Israel. Jews are extremely proud, and it makes sense, right, in the aftermath of the war, that they will want to celebrate the people who are the heroes of the resistance movements. And so the fact that the Zionist movement can say it's our people, right, gives them a great deal of credibility, and it helps turn them into leaders of the Jewish public after the war. So this is why that competition over credit matters so much, because in the aftermath of the war, it plays an important role in determining who are going to be the leaders of the Jewish public, who's going to help convince the surviving Jewish population that you should make your future, right, not in Poland. There's nothing for you to return to in Poland. You can't stay in Germany, because of all places, ironically, that's the safest place for Jews to be in DP camps after the war. The United States is not changing its immigration policy after the war. The only future for the Jewish people is in the land of Israel, right? So we can see how like that political interpretation then has very significant implications in the aftermath of the war.